The church was hushed, a soft hum of anticipation hanging in the air like a delicate thread. Emily stood at the altar, her pristine white wedding gown cascading around her like a cloud, the lace shimmering under the warm glow of the chandeliers. She radiated joy, her cheeks flushed with a bride's quiet excitement. Beside her, Daniel shifted slightly, his tuxedo crisp, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles whitened. His smile flickered, nervous but steady. The priest's voice droned softly, the familiar cadence of the ceremony wrapping the room in calm, until a sharp, jarring rip tore through the silence. Gasps erupted like a wave crashing over the pews. Max, Emily's golden retriever and designated ring-bearer, bounded forward, his teeth sinking into the hem of her dress. The fabric gave way with a jagged tear, splitting up to her knee, her bare leg exposed to the stunned crowd. "Max, no!" Emily screamed, her voice cracking as she stumbled back. Guests froze, wide-eyed, while Daniel lurched forward, grabbing at the dog's collar to yank him away. Chaos swallowed the moment whole. The priest faltered mid-sentence, his words tangling into a stutter as he clutched his Bible, unsure whether to pray or intervene. Sarah, Emily's maid of honor, dashed from her spot, her heels clicking frantically against the polished floor. She reached for Max, who barked furiously, his golden fur bristling as he strained against her grip. His eyes fixed on Daniel. Emily dropped to her knees, the torn gown pooling around her, tears welling in her eyes as she cupped Max's face. "What's wrong, boy?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Max had been her shadow since college, a steady present through late-night study sessions, failed relationships, and lonely nights. She'd fought to include him in the wedding, tying the rings to his collar with a satin ribbon, convinced it'd be a charming memory. Despite Daniel's grumbling about shedding fur and muddy paws, now shame burned her cheeks as her perfect day unraveled stitch by stitch. Daniel's face flushed crimson, his jaw tight. "Get that mud out of here," he snapped, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Max growled low, refusing to back down, his gaze locked on Daniel like a hunter sizing up prey. Emily's mother, Linda, pushed through the crowd, her silver heels clicking with purpose. "Everyone please, let's calm down," she said, her tone firm but soothing, hands raised to quiet the rising tide of whispers. Guests leaned forward in their seats, some clutching pearls, others exchanging hushed theories. Dogs could sense evil, couldn't they? An old superstition, a bad omen. Emily shook her head, brushing it off as wedding day jitters gone wild. She stood, tugging at the ragged hem of her dress, forcing a shaky smile. "It's fine," she said, nodding at the priest. "Let's keep going." But as she smoothed the fabric, a tiny splinter of doubt lodged in her chest, sharp and cold. Max Gresham wasn't like him. He'd never so much as snarled at a stranger. Why now? Why Daniel? The priest cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses, and resumed, his voice a touch too loud in the uneasy quiet. "Do you, Emily, take this man?" The words barely left his mouth when Max broke free again, slipping from Sarah's grasp with a determined lunge. His jaws clamped onto Daniel's pant leg this time, the crisp black fabric ripping as Daniel stumbled backward, arms flailing. "Damn it!" he cursed, his shout bouncing off the vaulted ceiling. The crowd gasped louder, a few nervous laughs breaking through the tension, while others muttered about cursed unions and warning signs. Emily's heart slammed against her ribs. She'd never seen Max like this, wild and relentless. Daniel shoved the dog hard, sending Max skidding across the floor with a yelp. "Enough!" he roared, brushing off his torn pants and storming to the side of the altar, leaving Emily standing alone, her hands clutching the shredded gown. She met Max's eyes, now soft and whimpering, as if he were begging her to listen. Her breath caught, a storm of confusion swirling inside her. The ceremony hung in an awkward limbo. Emily swallowed hard, torn between humiliation and a gnawing unease she couldn't name. She waved Daniel back, her voice low. "I'm sorry, come on, let's finish this." He returned, smoothing his hair with a tight, forced grin, his eyes darting to the guests. The priest rushed through the vows, words tumbling over each other, and soon they were pronounced husband and wife. Their kiss was brief, mechanical. The cheers from the crowd muted and uncertain. As their lips met, Max's low growl rumbled from the sidelines, too quiet for most to hear. Emily's joy felt thin, fragile. The tear in her dress a loud, ugly scar on the day she'd dreamed of. A question gnawed at her, sharp and unrelenting. Why did Max hate Daniel so much? The reception hall glowed with the soft flicker of twinkling lights strung across the ceiling, casting a warm sheen over the dance floor. Emily swayed in Daniel's arms, her torn wedding dress hastily patched with safety pins that glinted faintly as they moved. She tried to lose herself in the music, the slow rhythm of their first dance as husband and wife, but the weight of the day pressed against her chest. Guests raised their glasses, toasting to love and forever, their smiles bright and oblivious. At the edge of the room, Max sat tethered to a chair with a leash, his golden fur ruffled, ears pinned back. His eyes followed Daniel with an intensity that prickled Emily's skin. She forced a laugh, leaning towards Sarah as the song ended. "Guess Max wanted to be the groom," she said, her voice light but brittle. Sarah grinned, but Emily's smile slipped as she caught Daniel hunched over his phone under the table, thumbs flying across the screen, his brow creased in a tight frown. The night wore on, threaded with small, jagged moments that snagged at Emily's nerves. Daniel slipped away from the head table again and again, muttering about quick calls as he disappeared through the double doors. Emily stood alone, shaking hands and thanking aunts and cousins, her laughter hollow as she waved off their questions about her dress. During a lull, Sarah, cheeks flushed from too much champagne, tugged Emily behind a floral centerpiece. "I've always thought he's too smooth," she slurred, her words spilling out. "You know, rumors, girls at his office, late nights he couldn't explain. I didn't say anything before, but—" Emily waved her off, a sharp pang twisting in her gut. "He's just busy, Sarah, ambitious." She clung to the memory of their first meeting. 2 years ago at a charity gala, Daniel's easy charm and sharp suit dazzling her under the ballroom lights. Max had never taken to him, always watching from a distance with a quiet unease, but she'd told herself it was jealousy. Her dog protecting his place in her heart. Across the room, Max strained against his leash, a low whine rising in his throat every time Daniel re-entered. His tail stayed still, his body tense, a stark contrast to the wagging bundle of joy he'd been all day. Emily's younger brother Jake sprawled in a chair nearby, his phone glowing as he scrolled. He glanced up, smirking. Max is onto something. Maybe Daniel's got a secret wife stashed somewhere? The table erupted in laughter, but Emily's chuckle caught in her throat. The words lingered, heavy and unwelcome. She thought of Daniel's recent quirks. Whispered calls he'd cut short when she walked in. Cancelled dinners blamed on work. That faint pink smear on his collar he'd laughed off as a co-worker's makeup mishap. She'd believed him, hadn't she? As the night dwindled, the band packing up and guests trickling out, Emily knelt beside Max, untying his leash. "Go stretch your legs, buddy," she murmured, ruffling his ears. He bolted upright, darting through the crowd with purpose, straight toward the patio doors. Emily followed, curiosity tugging her outside. Daniel stood there, a cigarette glowing between his fingers, his groomsman leaning against the railing mid-lap. Max planted himself in front of Daniel and barked, a sharp, relentless sound that split the night air. Emily stepped closer, the damp grass cool against her bare feet. Daniel's head snapped up, his phone vanishing into his pocket as his face drained of color. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice tentative. He flicked the cigarette away, his jaw tight. "Control your damn dog," he bit out, harsher than she'd expected. Max circled him, growling low, his hackles raised. Emily crouched beside him, her hands sinking into his fur. "What do you see that I don't?" she whispered, her pulse quickening as Daniel turned away, avoiding her gaze. The reception faded into a blur of goodbyes, Emily's feet aching as she hugged the last guests. She and Daniel climbed into the car for the short drive to their honeymoon suite. Max handed off to Sarah with a quick pat. The silence between them was thick, Daniel's hand cold and limp in hers as he stared out the window. Emily gripped her bouquet, the petals bruised and drooping, the rustle of her torn dress filling the quiet. She replayed Max's snarls, his frantic barks, and felt the day's sheen peel away. Was it all a facade? Her mind churned with his warnings, loud and insistent, but she shoved them down, clutching at the mantra that love meant trust. She squeezed Daniel's hand, willing herself to believe it. Still, the cracks in her certainty stretched wider, thin lines spidering through the life she'd built in her head. Emily woke to the hush of the honeymoon suite, the morning light filtering through heavy curtains. She reached across the bed, expecting Daniel's warmth, but found only cold, untouched sheets. His suitcase sat unopened in the corner, a crumpled note on the nightstand catching her eye. "Went for coffee, back soon." She frowned, a flicker of unease curling in her chest. The clock read 8:47, too early for him to be gone long, yet the stillness felt wrong. Her phone buzzed on the dresser, shattering the quiet. Sarah's name flashed on the screen, her voice spilling out in a frantic rush when Emily answered. "Get to my place now, Max found something." She didn't bother changing, throwing on a jacket over her wrinkled wedding clothes, silk blouse and skirt from the reception, and raced out the door. The drive to Sarah's apartment blurred past in a haze of stoplights and honking horns, her hands tight on the wheel. Sarah met her at the door, pale and wide-eyed, clutching a phone Emily recognized instantly. Daniel's, the one he'd claimed to lose at the reception. "Max wouldn't stop growling," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "He dug it out from under the couch." Jake lounged on the sofa, smirking as he tossed a charger aside. "Cracked the passcode in 10 minutes, he said, handing it to Emily. Her fingers trembled as she swiped through the messages. Dozens from Lisa, a name she vaguely recalled from Daniel's office chatter. The texts were a punch to the gut, flirty quips, selfies of a brunette in low-cut tops, plans to meet that night. Her breath caught on the last one, time-stamped during the reception. "Wedding's done. See you soon, babe." Her stomach lurched, the phone nearly slipping from her grasp. Memories crashed over her like a tide. Daniel's vague excuses for late nights, his phone angled away from her, the growing distance she'd chalked up to wedding stress. Max patted over, nudging her leg with his nose, his brown eyes soft and steady. She sank to the floor beside him, her knees weak, as if he were saying, "I tried to tell you." Sarah knelt too, wrapping an arm around her. "He's a jerk, Em. You deserve better," she whispered, her voice thick with anger and pity. Emily's hands shook, the screen blurring through tears. Max rested his head on her lap, a quiet anchor in the storm tearing through her. She drove back to the hotel with Max in the passenger seat, his ears perked as if sensing the fire building inside her. Her mind raced, replaying every bark, every growl he'd aimed at Daniel. The hotel lobby was afog as she marched to their room, catching Daniel strolling in, 2 coffee cups in hand, his face relaxed and maddeningly casual. "Hey, babe," he started, but she cut him off, flinging the phone at his chest. It clattered to the floor, screen glowing with Lisa's words. "Who's Lisa?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to slice through steel. He froze, coffee sloshing over his hands, his face flushing red. I don't," he stammered, then hardened. "You're paranoid. This is why Max hates me." Emily stepped closer, fury rising. "No, he hates you because you're a liar," she shouted, her words echoing down the hall. She turned on her heel, Max barking a triumphant salvo at Daniel's stunned figure. "Emily, wait, I'm sorry," he yelled. But she didn't look back, the door slamming shut behind her. In the car, she collapsed against the steering wheel, tears streaming down her face, hot and relentless. Max licked her hand, his rough tongue a small comfort against the betrayal slicing her open. She'd trusted Daniel, built a future in her mind, and now it lay shattered, jagged edges cutting deeper with every breath. But Max's steady presence grounded her, his loyalty a lifeline. She started the engine, heading for her parents' house, the decision firm in her gut. The marriage was over. She'd file for an annulment by week's end. The torn dress, once a mark of ruin, flashed in her memory, now a badge of survival she'd wear with pride. She reached over, stroking Max's fur. "You saved me, boy," she whispered, her voice raw. The truth was out, stark and brutal, and the wound bled fresh. She wasn't ready to heal, not yet, but she'd face it with Max by her side. Weeks later, Emily strolled along a quiet beach, the sand cool beneath her sneakers. Max trotted beside her, his golden fur catching the late afternoon sun. Her left hand felt light, the wedding ring long gone, tossed into a drawer she hadn't opened since. The annulment papers were filed, Daniel erased from her life like a bad dream. She wore faded jeans and a soft sweater, the torn wedding dress folded neatly in a box at home. A memory she wasn't ready to unpack, but couldn't throw away. The chaos of that day lingered in her mind, a storm she was still navigating. Her parents had enveloped her in hugs and home-cooked meals, their quiet support a balm. Sarah checked in daily, dragging her out for coffee or movie nights, refusing to let her wallow. Max, though, was her rock. His steady gaze and wagging tail pulled her through the darkest moments. She'd started therapy, sitting across from a kind-eyed woman who helped her untangle the blind trust she'd poured into Daniel. "I ignored so much," she admitted one session, her voice tight. Friends trickled in with confessions, red flags they'd noticed, his slick charm, his wandering eyes. But they'd stayed silent, fearing they'd dim her wedding glow. She forgave them, her anger softening into a resolve to rebuild herself. She dusted off her old paintbrushes, a passion Daniel had once scoffed at, calling it cute but pointless. Now, the canvas absorbed her grief, colors bleeding into something raw and beautiful, a quiet solace she hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, Jake burst into her apartment, his phone thrust out like a trophy. "You've got to see this," he said, grinning. It was a video from the wedding, Max leaping at her dress, teeth flashing, the tears splitting wide. It had gone viral, racking up thousands of views, comments flooding in. "Dog knows best. Four-legged hero." Emily watched, her laugh bubbling up, sharp and real, the first in weeks. She scratched Max's ears as he sprawled beside her, his tongue lolling out. "You saved me from years of that mess, didn't you?" she said, the weight of his instincts settling over her like a shield. The dog park stretched wide under a gray sky, Max bounding ahead to chase a tennis ball. Emily sipped coffee from a thermos, her breath fogging in the crisp air, when a familiar figure caught her eye. Lisa, hair shorter than in the photos, eyes tired, stood near the gate. Daniel slouched beside her. He looked thinner, his jaw tight, misery etched into every line. Max froze mid-step, then barked, loud and sharp, barreling toward them. Emily's heart stuttered, but she didn't call him back. Lisa stepped forward, hands raised. "Emily, I'm sorry," she said, her voice small. "He lied to me too, said you were over months ago. I didn't know." Daniel shifted, eyes on the ground, silent. Emily felt a pang, anger, pity, a flicker of the old hurt. But she straightened, her voice steady. "He's your problem now." Max barked again, a single triumphant note, and Daniel flinched, stepping back. Emily turned, whistling for Max to follow, her head high as she walked away. It wasn't revenge, not really. Just closure, clean and final, the last thread of him snipped free. Back home, the living room buzzed with warmth, a small gathering of the people who'd held her up. Her parents clinked glasses with Sarah, Jake sprawled on the couch with a slice of pizza, and Max sprawled at her feet, his tail thumping against the floor. Emily raised her wine glass, the light catching the ruby liquid. "To new beginnings," she said, her voice clear, the words a promise to herself. Laughter filled the space, soft and easy, wrapping her in something solid. On the wall, the torn dress hung framed, its jagged edges softened by time, a testament to resilience she'd earned the hard way. She wasn't whole yet, not fully. The cracks of betrayal still ached some nights, but she was free. She glanced down at Max, his eyes half closed in contentment, and smiled. He'd ripped her wedding apart to save her heart, and for that, she'd always be grateful. Emily stood on the shore, the waves whispering against the sand as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink. Max bounded through the surf, his bark echoing with a joy that mirrored her own, a quiet, hard-won peace. She'd come through the fire, her heart bruised but beating stronger, all because of the dog who'd seen what she couldn't. The torn dress, the betrayal, the chaos. They were chapters closed, lessons carved into her soul. Now, with Max by her side, every step felt like a promise of something better, something true. If this story of loyalty, heartbreak, and redemption touched you, there's so much more waiting. Subscribe to the Amazing Paws Stories channel for tales of incredible dogs like Max, heroes with fur and wagging tails who change lives in ways you'll never forget. Hit that button, join the pack, and let's celebrate the unbreakable bond between humans and their four-legged saviors. See you in the next story.
He came back from the war with nothing but a scarred mind and a service dog who'd saved his life more than once. Haunted by PTSD and the death of his wife, he bought a rusted shipping container for shelter because it was all he could afford. People laughed. They pointed. They called him the crazy vet in a metal box. But one day, while installing a shelf, his loyal German shepherd started barking at a spot in the wall. Behind it, the soldier found a small metal box. Inside, over $1 million in a letter that would rewrite everything he thought he knew about fate, dignity, and what it truly means to come home. What happened next will break your heart and then heal it again. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. And if you believe every veteran and every dog deserves more than silence and sorrow, hit that subscribe button. This story might just change how you see redemption. The wind off Lake Michigan was sharp that morning, needling through the bare branches that arched over the half-abandoned roads of Asheville, a quiet town on the edge of forgetting itself. A gray sky hung low above the warehouses and cracked sidewalks, the kind of sky that made everything feel heavier. Ethan Walker pulled the collar of his worn jacket tighter as he stepped off the Greyhound bus, a single duffel slung over his shoulder. At 38, he looked older, not by age, but by weight, the kind that settled in a man's eyes and never left. His build was lean but muscular, the kind forged by years of military training and barely maintained through restless nights and scattered meals. His face was square, a faded scar near his temple, short brown hair peppered with gray, and storm-colored eyes that rarely looked up. Beside him padded Ranger, a 10-year-old German shepherd with a sable and silver coat dulled by time. One ear bent permanently from a past injury, and a long scar ran down his right hind leg. Yet he moved with the quiet precision of an old soldier, alert, controlled, always watching. Ranger had once been a proud K-9 unit in the same platoon Ethan served, and in many ways was the only family he had left. They walked in silence down the cracked pavement of Main Street. No one greeted them. A boy on a bike stared, a woman tugged her coat closed and hurried into a diner. It wasn't hostility, just the kind of wary detachment towns like Asheville grew around strangers. Ethan didn't mind. He had returned to the U.S. 6 months ago from Afghanistan, but he hadn't been home in years. Not really. His wife, Lena, had died in a car accident while he was still deployed. A drunk driver, a late call, a closed casket. No goodbye. Just a folded flag and voicemail messages he could never bring himself to delete. That loss had cracked something open in him. What war hadn't broken, grief finished. PTSD hit him like shrapnel, not in the chest but behind the eyes. Some days Ethan couldn't sleep. Other days he didn't wake fully. Ranger had saved him more than once, barking, nudging, pawing him back from the brink when memories became traps. That morning, Ethan had no clear destination. The small VA housing support had run out. He'd spent the last 2 weeks sleeping in shelters and, when full, under bridges. His savings were gone, his tools sold. All that remained were the memories he couldn't outrun, and Ranger. Then came a conversation overheard behind a truck stop diner. "Old man Devins is selling off those busted shipping containers behind the scrapyard. $20 if you can haul it out, $100 if you want him to drop it somewhere." It stuck in Ethan's mind. Not because it was glamorous, but because it was his. A place no one could take away. Not a shelter with rotating beds. Not a friend's couch with pity in their eyes. A steel shell. 4 walls. A door that closed. So now he stood before Devon's salvage yard, a spread of rusted metal, broken machinery, and the sharp smell of oil and damp. Walter Devons, the owner, was a stooped, leathery man in his 70s with oil-stained hands and a cap that hadn't been washed since Reagan was president. He looked Ethan over with a grunt, nodding once at Ranger. "You the vet looking for a box?" he said, without introduction, his voice rough like gravel in a tin can. "I heard you got one," Ethan replied. Devons jerked his thumb toward the back lot. "She ain't pretty. Leaks a little. Floor's cold as a witch's kiss." Ethan looked to Ranger, who merely sat and stared forward, unmoving, the way he always did when Ethan needed grounding. "I'll take it," Ethan said. Devons blinked but shrugged. $100 and I'll have it dropped wherever." Ethan fished out the last of his savings from a pouch inside the duffel. As he handed it over, Devons looked again, not unkind, just curious. "You planning on living in it?" "I'm not planning much of anything," Ethan answered quietly. That evening, Ethan found an alley behind the old bus depot where he and Ranger could stay the night. The concrete was cracked, but there was a bit of overhang from the roof, just enough to keep the wind off. Ranger curled into his usual watchful pose, head resting over his paws, eyes scanning the dark. Ethan sat with his back against the wall, knees pulled up, the night pressing down like a memory he couldn't shake. Somewhere, a train wailed in the distance, that long, aching sound that reminded him too much of helicopters leaving base, of promises not kept. He took out the last of the dry crackers from his duffel, broke one in half, and offered it to Ranger. The dog sniffed it, accepted it gently, and lay back down. No words were exchanged. There didn't need to be. As Ethan stared into the dark, he remembered something Lena once said during a video call from his deployment. "Home isn't a place. It's wherever you stop running long enough to breathe." His breath trembled in the cold, but for the first time in a long while, he considered what it might mean to stop running. The next morning, before the city fully woke, Ethan rose and slung the duffel over his shoulder. Ranger stood, stretching silently beside him. They began walking again, this time toward the edge of town. He didn't know what he'd find there. But in his pocket was a slip of paper with a name and location scribbled in pen, Devon's Salvage Yard. And something in his gut told him it might be where he could finally stop. The container sat like a forgotten relic on the edge of Cedar Grove, a rusting monolith surrounded by brittle grass and the broken shells of empty beer bottles. Wind dragged dry leaves across the lot like whispers of things long dead. The old auto shop next door hadn't opened in years, its windows painted over and vines curling through the cracked cement. A bent chain-link fence marked the border of Ethan's new domain. To most, it was a scar on the edge of town. To Ethan, it was a beginning. Inside, the air smelled of old metal, mold, and something faintly chemical-like oil that had long soaked into the floor. The walls were bare steel, streaked with orange corrosion and deep scratches. One corner had a puddle where the roof leaked from a seam. The floor, ridged and uneven, groaned under every footstep. It was bitter cold. Each breath from Ethan and Ranger hung briefly in the air like smoke before vanishing into stillness. Ethan dropped his duffel and unrolled a new sleeping mat over the spot least exposed to the draft. Ranger paced the edges of the container, nose low to the ground, sniffing with intensity. His ears twitched. Suddenly, he stopped, growled low, and darted into the corner near the puddle. A sharp squeak followed by a scuffle. Moments later, Ranger emerged with a twitching tail in his mouth, a rat. He dropped it near the door and returned to patrol. "Guess it's yours now, huh?" Ethan murmured. Later that afternoon, Ethan found a broken broom left behind the auto shop. He swept the container slowly, each motion stirring up gray clouds of dust. Ranger sneezed, then sat by the entrance, eyes on the street. A boy on a scooter stopped across the road and pointed. His mother, a petite woman in a white fleece coat, pulled him away by the arm. From inside the container, Ethan could hear their voices echo down the street. "Mom, why's that man living in there?" "Hush, baby. Don't look." "But he has a dog." "I said hush." It wasn't long before the whispers spread. That evening, as dusk fell and a brittle frost crept across the grass, a group of teenagers strolled past, their voices half loud, half laughing. "Dude, he's really sleeping in that thing? Bet he talks to his dog all night. Freaking war crazy. I heard he eats out of cans like a raccoon." Ethan didn't move. He sat on the floor, back against the cold wall, Ranger curled at his feet like a guard statue. He'd heard worse before. Words couldn't pierce what shrapnel and grief already had. By nightfall, the container had chilled like a tomb. The small army blanket wasn't enough to fight the cold. Ethan lay curled, jacket zipped tight, knees drawn in. Ranger moved closer, pressing his body against Ethan's chest, acting as a living heater. Every few minutes, a howl of wind battered the side panels and the metal groaned like a ship at sea. Ethan didn't sleep much. His mind kept returning to the war, to Lena. He saw the road outside the base, the flicker of headlights just before the call came in. He saw her smile from an old photo god. He couldn't even remember where it was now. His body jerked in the dark as the memory surged. Ranger, sensing the tension, stood and stepped over Ethan's chest, placing his full weight gently across him, nose touching cheek. It worked. The pressure, the warmth, it brought Ethan back, grounded him in the present. The next morning, the lot was covered in a thin glaze of frost. Ranger barked once, sharp, when a delivery van slowed near the curb. Inside, Ethan rubbed his eyes, stretched stiff limbs, and began again. He propped the container doors wide, letting the light in. Across the street, a woman watched from her porch, Mrs. Geraldine Parker, mid-60s, stout, with short gray curls and a red flannel robe. She was known in the neighborhood for her sharp tongue and sharper eyes. Geraldine had lived on that street since Nixon's second term. Her husband had died a decade ago, leaving her with a creaky porch swing and a twice-rescued tabby cat named Cinnamon. She narrowed her eyes at Ethan that morning, muttered something under her breath, and retreated inside. As Ethan worked to patch a leak in the roof using strips of old tarp and duct tape, a man in coveralls walked past. He was tall, in his 50s, with a sun-worn face and a limp in one leg. Ben Lott, a mechanic who ran the last standing garage 3 blocks over. He didn't speak, but he nodded once, the kind of nod veterans exchanged without needing words. Ethan nodded back. Later that day, Ethan found a stack of cinder blocks behind the shop and used them to prop up a small wooden board he'd found in the weeds, a makeshift table. He placed Ranger's food bowl there, then his own can of beans. Ranger sat beside him as they shared a quiet meal. The air smelled faintly of burnt leaves from somewhere nearby. A radio played soft country music from a neighbor's cracked window. For a moment, Ethan closed his eyes, not in sleep, but in stillness. That night, he stacked cardboard along the inner walls for insulation. It wasn't much, but it dulled the bite of wind. Ranger stood at the door again, facing out. Not as a dog waiting to escape, but as a sentinel. Ethan watched him and whispered, "We're not just surviving this time, we're staying." The morning sun had barely cleared the rooftops of Cedar Grove when Ethan took a deep breath and stepped back into the container with a plan. After 2 days of clearing rat droppings, sweeping dust, and sealing leaks with scrap tarp, it still wasn't a home. Not yet. But something about the rusting steel shell had begun to settle into his bones, like the quiet rhythm of a soldier's march, predictable, stable, honest. Ranger lay near the open doors, ears twitching with every passing bird call or distant car engine. The old German shepherd had found his spot, a square of sunlight on the floor that warmed his stiff joints. Ethan smiled at the sight and turned back to the wall where he intended to build a makeshift shelf, nothing fancy, just something to keep his supplies off the cold floor. He hammered a nail into one of the vertical steel braces when Ranger abruptly stood and let out a sharp bark. Ethan turned, startled. Ranger's body was stiff, head turned toward the far back corner of the container. Another bark, followed by a low growl. Ethan watched, curious, as the dog walked slowly toward the wall, nose close to the floor. Then came the scratching. Ranger's front paws began digging furiously at the seam where two wall panels met in the corner. His claws scraped against the metal, tail raised in alert, eyes locked on something Ethan couldn't see. Ethan squinted at the spot he'd passed it dozens of times without a second glance. The rust patterns, the shadows, the dirt, it all blended together. But now, under Ranger's insistence, he looked closer. Ethan retrieved his flashlight from the duffel. The beam illuminated a faint gap just wide enough to slide a few fingers into. Dust had settled over it thickly, and thin cobwebs clung to the seam like lace. He grabbed a flathead screwdriver and wedged it carefully between the edges, slowly prying it loose. The metal creaked, resisted, then gave way with a soft clunk. Ethan reached in. His fingers brushed cold steel. He pulled out a small box metal, square, about the size of a lunch container. It was old, the paint peeling and edges dented. Moisture had left faint green speckles of mold on the surface. The latch stuck, and for a second, Ethan considered leaving it be, but his hands moved anyway, prying gently, then firmly. The lid popped open with a groan. Inside lay several bundles of U.S. currency $100 bills, worn and yellowed at the edges, but unmistakably real. They were tied with brittle rubber bands, some already snapping under time's weight. Next to them, a sealed envelope, faded beige, with no name on it. Only one sentence, scribbled in a slanted, uneven hand. If you found this, maybe you need it more than I ever did. Use it wisely. Ethan didn't move for a long time. He sat on the floor, staring at the contents, heart thumping in his ears. Outside, the wind shifted and blew a curtain of dry leaves across the yard. Ranger lay beside him, eyes trained not on the box, but on Ethan himself, as if waiting for his reaction. Ethan exhaled, slowly. "What the hell is this, boy?" The dog didn't answer. He just placed his head gently on Ethan's knee, warm and solid. Ethan absently scratched behind his bent ear. The box contained what had to be conservatively several $100,000, maybe more. The bills were real. The ink was faded, but not counterfeit. Ethan had handled enough military logistics to know the feel of authentic paper. He didn't count it. Not yet. His mind raced, not with greed, but with disbelief. Who would leave this? Why hide it here? He examined the container walls again. Perhaps it had once been used for illicit transport drugs, weapons, money laundering. But the envelope, that single sentence wasn't criminal. It was human. It felt like desperation, or hope. As the sun climbed higher, Ethan closed the box and placed it beside him. He pulled his blanket closer, not because of the cold, but the weight of possibility. Ranger still sat beside the container, now facing outward again, watchful as ever. Later that day, a familiar sound echoed near the chain-link fence gravel shifting under worn tires. A dark green truck rolled by slowly, its bed filled with scrap lumber and rusted bike frames. Behind the wheel sat Raymond Cook, the man who ran the nearby metal yard. Raymond was in his early 40s, lean with a crooked nose and calloused hands. Known for being rough around the edges, he rarely smiled, but wasn't unkind. He rolled down his window and squinted. "You good in there?" Ethan stood, dusting off his jeans. "Just fixing up." Raymond jerked his chin toward Ranger. "Dog's got good ears. Heard him barking from my yard." "Found something interesting in the wall," Ethan replied. He wasn't lying, but he wasn't explaining either. Raymond shrugged. "Well, if you need scrap, I've got a pile behind the shed. Nobody'll miss it." "Thanks." Ethan nodded. As Raymond pulled away, Ethan looked back at the box. Ranger had returned to it, now lying beside it with his head resting on top like a silent guardian. Ethan chuckled. "You found it. Maybe it's yours." That night, he didn't sleep much. Not from fear, but from thought. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattle the container. Ranger lay close by, steady breathing rising and falling. The dog had always been more than a companion. In Afghanistan, Ranger had saved his life, sensing a pressure plate bomb before Ethan ever saw it. Since returning home, the dog had calmed his nightmares, barked when he thrashed, placed a paw on his chest to anchor him back to reality. And now, this. Ranger hadn't just protected Ethan. He had led him. The metal box sat between them, sealed again, like a secret waiting for its moment. Ethan didn't know yet what he would do with it. But as he reached down and ran his fingers through Ranger's coarse fur, he whispered, "We'll figure it out. Together." Outside, the wind howled, but inside that cold iron box, something had shifted. It wasn't just shelter anymore, it was fate. The box sat on the corner of Ethan's makeshift pallet, sealed again with its dented lid and the faded envelope tucked neatly beneath the topmost bundle of bills. It hadn't moved all day, yet its presence loomed like a shadow stretching long across his thoughts. Every time his eyes drifted, they landed back on it, as if it were watching him instead of the other way around. Outside, night had settled thick over Cedar Grove. The container groaned softly as temperatures dropped. A thin sheet of ice had started forming along the edges of the puddle near the corner where Ranger had found the box. Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, a can of beans half-eaten beside him, untouched for an hour. His heart felt tight in his chest. He had handled military-grade explosives, pulled friends out of burning vehicles, even stared down the barrel of a rifle in the hands of a boy not older than 14. But this box of money scared him in a way bullets never had. He stood abruptly and began pacing the length of the container. Ranger, who had been curled up near the door, lifted his head, one ear twitching, then watched silently. His silver-streaked coat glowed faintly in the dim light from the battery lamp Ethan had rigged 2 nights ago. "How does something like that even end up here?" Ethan muttered aloud. "How long's it been hiding?" His mind spun with theories. Maybe it was mob money, stashed in a panic and forgotten. Maybe drug money, hidden during a police chase. Or maybe something darker. Maybe the person who hid it never got the chance to return. He thought of the note again, use it wisely. It chilled him more than the wind outside. What if someone came looking for it? What if the town caught wind of it? What if this twisted his soul the way combat never did? Ranger rose and approached quietly. The dog's joints clicked faintly, a reminder of old injuries. He nuzzled Ethan's hand, then sat squarely in front of the box, laying one paw gently on its lid. Not protectively, almost thoughtfully. Ethan let out a dry laugh. "You guarding it now?" Ranger didn't move. That night, Ethan lay beneath 2 blankets, the box wedged between his backpack and the container wall. He hadn't told anyone. Not Raymond, not Geraldine, not the grizzled old guy from the corner lot who sometimes passed him a coffee with no words exchanged. It was his secret, and secrets had weight. At some point in the early hours, sleep dragged him under. But it wasn't peaceful. He found himself back in the desert. Not Afghanistan exactly, but some twisted version of it. Red skies, broken shadows, bodies that shifted like smoke. He was running. Ranger was gone. Lena was calling his name, but he couldn't turn toward her. Then came the sound of gunfire, close and sharp, followed by blood splattering across his hands that held a wad of money, not a weapon. He woke with a strangled gasp, shirt drenched in sweat. The box was still there. Real. Solid. Ranger stood above him, breathing steady, warm breath fogging in the air between them. Without hesitation, the dog lowered his head and rested it on Ethan's arm. The weight was grounding, familiar, a lifeline. Ethan inhaled slowly, eyes closing again, not to sleep, but to breathe. Just breathe. When morning light trickled through the crack in the container doors, he sat up and reached for the envelope again. The paper felt older than the money inside. That sentence still haunted him. Maybe you need it more than I ever did. Who had written it? A criminal with a guilty conscience? A dying man with no heirs? Or just someone who, like Ethan, had once been desperate enough to crawl into a metal box and call it shelter? The possibilities swirled like dust in sunlight. Later that day, he wandered down the street and into a narrow alley where discarded wood and broken crates leaned against a brick wall. A young woman was picking through scrap tall, slender, wearing a faded army surplus coat with a tear at the sleeve. She had short dark hair, sharp cheekbones, and a wary energy in her posture. Her name was Nina Clark, mid-20s, a drifter who'd recently appeared in Cedar Grove. She'd been sleeping in her car outside the abandoned diner, keeping mostly to herself, speaking only when spoken to. Ethan offered a nod. "Looking for building supplies?" Nina glanced up, hesitated, then nodded. "Something to cover my windows. Frost came through last night." Her voice was low, tired, but not unfriendly. Ethan handed her a wooden slat he'd just pulled from the pile. "Use this. Won't keep you warm, but it'll block the wind." She accepted it without a smile, but her eyes softened. "Thanks." He watched her leave, the plank awkward under one arm. Someone else, barely hanging on. It hit him then, harder than expected. He wasn't the only one. Back in the container, Ranger waited at the door, tail thumping once against the wall when Ethan returned. Ethan sat beside the box again. He didn't open it this time, he just stared. Maybe it wasn't a curse, maybe it was a chance. But whose? That night, Ethan didn't dream, or if he did, he didn't remember. He slept a little deeper, a little warmer. Ranger curled beside him, the cold biting a little less than the night before. Cedar Grove had always been a town of quiet routines. The same names filled the mailboxes, the same faces passed down the same sidewalks. Change didn't come here often, and when it did, it usually wore the face of bad news. But lately, something had begun to shift, subtle as the early thaw of spring. No one could quite put their finger on it. Yet, kindness had started to ripple through the cracks. It began with Marla Jennings, a single mother of two who lived on the east side of town in a weathered yellow house with flaking trim. Marla was in her mid-30s, tall and wiry, her blonde hair usually tied up in a messy bun. She worked double shifts at the diner and still couldn't keep up with the mortgage. Folks knew she was behind. What they didn't know was that her final notice had arrived the same day her youngest came down with a fever. The bank called off the foreclosure a day later. No explanation. Just a payment made in full, anonymous. Marla cried in her car that night, clutching the letter in her lap. A week later, Mrs. Beatrice Holloway, the elderly widow who ran the flower stand by the bus station, suddenly received the heart medication she hadn't been able to afford since her insurance lapsed. The pharmacist said it had already been paid for 3 months' worth. When Beatrice asked who did it, the answer was the same. A man with a dog. Left cash. Didn't say a word. And then there was the library. Cedar Grove's tiny public library had been scheduled to shut down by the end of the month. Its roof leaked, the heating didn't work, and the children's section had water damage from a burst pipe 2 winters ago. One morning, the librarian Miss Dolores Hayes, a petite woman with thick glasses and hair like snowy cotton, arrived to find a donation envelope taped to the door. Inside was a typed note, for the roof and for the stories worth saving, and $6,000 in cash. People began to talk. At first, it was just speculation, but as more quiet acts of generosity unfolded, a name started to come up. Ethan Walker, the man in the rusted container, the soldier with the big dog and the faraway eyes, the one they used to whisper about. Now, their whispers carried something different: respect, wonder, even guilt. Ethan never said anything. He kept his head down, his hands busy, and let the rumors carry themselves. Ranger was always by his side, tail swaying gently, eyes scanning the world as if still on patrol. The townspeople had started calling him Sergeant Paws, a title Ranger bore with stoic indifference. Then came the lake. It was a Sunday afternoon when a group of kids wandered too close to the partially frozen edges of Lake Rensley, the town's shallow reservoir on the north edge. The ice had begun to thaw, deceptive in its thin veneer of frost. The children had been daring each other to throw rocks, sliding them across the surface to see who could get the furthest. One of them, Caleb Myers, 8 years old, small for his age with wild curls and a missing front tooth, stepped too close. The ice cracked. There was a splash, a scream, and then chaos. Ethan had been walking Ranger nearby, cutting through the woods behind the water treatment building when he heard the cries. Before he could react, Ranger had already bolted ears pinned, muscles coiled, paws pounding across frozen ground. Ethan followed, heart hammering. By the time he reached the shore, Ranger was halfway across the thinning ice. Caleb's head bobbed just above the surface, lips blue, arms flailing weakly. The boy had fallen through a soft spot and couldn't climb back. The other children stood helpless, shouting. Ranger didn't hesitate. He reached the edge of the broken ice, braced his back legs on a solid patch and extended his body as far as he could, teeth gently catching Caleb's jacket collar. The boy clung instinctively. Slowly, Ranger backed up, dragging Caleb inch by inch out of the freezing water. Ethan moved in the moment they were close enough, wading knee-deep into the slush to lift Caleb into his arms. He carried him straight to the old ranger station nearby, which still had a working radio. Paramedics arrived 15 minutes later. Caleb survived with nothing more than mild hypothermia and a newfound fear of lakes. But by Monday morning, the whole town had heard. That week, Ethan found a folded note slipped under the door of his container. In it were several pages of crayon drawing stick figures of a man and a dog, a big red heart, and in a child's handwriting, "Thank you for saving me. Ranger is my hero." The final drawing was of the container itself, with flowers drawn along the sides. Ethan tucked the letter inside his duffel, sat down beside Ranger, and scratched behind his bent ear. "You're getting famous," he muttered. The dog blinked slowly and licked his hand. That night, Geraldine Parker, who once refused to look Ethan in the eye, crossed the street with a casserole dish in hand. She didn't speak much, just handed it to him, mumbled something about chicken and rice, and shuffled back home. He watched her walk away, unsure what to say. Later, he shared the meal with Ranger under the soft hum of the solar lamp. The container walls felt different now. Not warmer, not cleaner, but alive, full of something that didn't exist before, a quiet sense of belonging. The wind howled over Cedar Grove like a warning whispered through the rusted husks of forgotten cars and leaning fences. The container home, now fortified with a makeshift wooden porch and patched roof, stood silent beneath a cold, silver moon. Inside, Ethan Walker sat hunched over a steaming mug of chamomile tea, his fingers twitching around the handle. Ranger lay nearby, ears half raised, eyes glinting amber in the dim light. There was unease in the air, he could feel it. News had traveled fast since the incident at the lake. People now looked at Ethan with more respect than pity, but not all attention was kind. Someone had talked, someone who'd seen too much, said too little. Word had spread beyond Cedar Grove, down darker roads and into shadows where men listened greedily for rumors of easy wealth. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. Not because of nightmares, but because he'd caught a stranger's eyes following him earlier at the gas station. A man in a black jacket, leaning against a dented car, watching too long before disappearing behind a row of trucks. It made Ethan's stomach knot. He glanced toward Ranger, who had not moved but whose eyes remained locked on the door. His companion was aging 10 years old now, his sable coat streaked with silver, his left ear permanently bent from a shrapnel wound in Kandahar. But his instincts were sharp as ever. When Ranger was uneasy, Ethan knew to trust it. Around 2 a.m., the sound came. A faint metallic clang like something brushing the outside wall. Ethan froze. Another sound, a scrape. Then, a soft series of thuds like boots on gravel. Ranger sprang to his feet, hackles raised, a deep growl forming in his chest. The old soldier in Ethan reacted before the man did. His body tensed, breath shortened. But this time, the tremble that came wasn't from fear, it was from memory. The pounding of mortar shells, the rattle of debris, screams in the smoke. His chest tightened. The steel walls seemed to close in. He couldn't breathe. The cup slipped from his hands, shattering on the floor. Panic clawed through him, familiar and cruel. Ranger moved. Not toward the door, but to Ethan. He pressed his heavy body against his master's legs, whined softly, nudging Ethan's hand with his snout. It was a routine they had fallen into many times. The grounding weight of the dog's presence pulled Ethan back from the brink. Then the sound of the lock being jimmied. Ranger bolted toward the door and barked sharp, commanding, terrifying in the silence of the night. Whoever was outside hadn't expected a dog, let alone a K9 trained for combat. There was a scuffle, a curse, and the crunch of running footsteps. Ethan scrambled for his phone, fingers shaking but managing to dial 911. His voice was hoarse but steady. "Someone tried to break into my home. Send help." Within 5 minutes, the howl of sirens echoed through the woods. Sheriff Tom Hensley stepped out of the cruiser, his flashlight beam cutting through the mist. Hensley was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-60s with a gray mustache and a weathered face that still held a soldier's intensity. He wore his uniform with the relaxed posture of someone who had seen too much to be startled anymore. He approached the container cautiously, until Ranger stepped out to meet him, tail held low but not aggressive. "Good boy," Hensley muttered, recognizing the bearing of a dog trained for defense. Then he looked up and stopped cold. "Ethan Walker?" Ethan stepped into the porch light, still shaken but upright. "Sir?" Tom's mouth parted slightly in surprise. "Hell, I'll be damned. Bravo Company, Kandahar, 2009? Recognition passed between them like lightning. "You're Sergeant Hensley," Ethan said, eyes widening. "I was," Tom nodded, "back when we both had better knees." The reunion was brief but grounding. Ethan explained the sounds, the attack, Ranger's response. Tom nodded along, occasionally glancing toward the darkened trees. "We've had a string of thefts outside town," he admitted. "Petty stuff. But something tells me they weren't looking for tools tonight." Ethan hesitated. Then slowly, he said, "There's money, hidden in the wall when I found this place." Tom didn't react with greed or shock. Instead, he let out a long sigh. "You've been helping folks around town, right? I heard rumors." "I didn't want recognition." "Well," Tom said, hand on his belt, "you might get more than that now. We'll post a patrol nearby for the next few nights, but you need to be careful. That kind of secret doesn't stay buried forever." Before leaving, Tom turned and offered a rare smile. "You always had guts, Walker. Guess the war didn't take that from you after all." As the cruisers drove off, Ethan sat back on the porch steps. Ranger settled beside him, leaning his head gently against Ethan's knee. The night returned to its quiet hum, but something had changed. For the first time in a long while, Ethan didn't feel alone in his battle. Morning in Cedar Grove came with birdsong and the distant hum of a tractor down the valley. The frost had finally yielded to spring, and the light spilled gently over the hill where Ethan's container stood. But it didn't look like the same rusted box anymore. For the past week, Ethan had been working from sunrise to dusk, a quiet determination in every stroke of his paintbrush and every board he nailed into place. The once dull gray steel now wore a warm sage green, trimmed with white edges he'd carefully measured and cut. He'd installed a window donated by the local junkyard and framed it with faded curtains someone had dropped off after hearing what he was building. The ground in front of the container had been transformed into a small garden. Nothing fancy, just a modest line of flower beds filled with marigolds, lavender, and bluebonnets. Sarah, the florist from town, had helped him pick the hardiest flowers. Sarah was a tall, graceful woman in her 50s, with salt and pepper curls always pulled into a bun and a voice as gentle as the petals she arranged. She had known grief herself. Her husband died of cancer a decade ago and had found healing in plants and people. She liked Ethan's quiet resolve and rarely asked him about the war. She just brought seeds, smiles, and spiced tea. Ethan dug the beds by hand, spreading mulch with a shovel and patting the soil down with his palms, as if the ground itself needed comfort. Ranger watched the transformation with endless curiosity. The old German shepherd, now 11, circled the edges of the plot every morning like a furry sentry. His sable coat shimmered in the new light, and his left ear still bent slightly, the way it always had since the day Ethan found him injured after an IED blast in Kandahar. To Ethan, this wasn't just a patch of land, it was sanctuary. And not just for him. The idea had come during a sleepless night when the nightmares were loud and the stars outside his window too silent. He'd whispered to Ranger, half laughing, half choking, "What if this old box of metal could be more than just our hiding spot, huh, buddy? What if it could heal more than me?" The next morning, he began clearing space inside. He knocked down the makeshift shelf he'd built months ago and opened the container's rear doors wide to let in the light. He restructured the layout to include 2 chairs, a fold-out cot, and a corner for warm blankets and canned food. A sign he painted on scrapwood hung just outside. "Rest here, no judgment, no questions." He called it the Blooming House, and soon people came. First was Martin, a 50-something vet with a limp and a haunted look in his eyes. He'd been sleeping under the bridge off Route 19, and word had reached him through another ex-Marine. Ethan gave him hot stew, clean socks, and a quiet night of sleep. Then came Joyce, a woman with weather-beaten skin and a bag full of medicine bottles. She didn't talk much, but she cried when Ethan gave her Ranger's blanket to use for the night. And each time, Ranger greeted them not with suspicion, but with gentle eyes and a wag of his tail. He would sniff their hands, sit beside them if they trembled, or just rest nearby, close enough to remind them they weren't alone. Children began stopping by too. One of them, a boy named Benny, had chestnut hair and large brown eyes that always seemed older than his years. Benny was 9, often alone, and had once seen Ranger rescue a child from the lake. One afternoon, as Ethan trimmed the grass and Ranger lay sunning himself nearby, Benny ran up with a small box wrapped in brown paper. "I saved up," he said shyly, holding it out. "For Ranger, he's a hero." Inside was a leather collar, clearly handmade. It was dark brown, worn soft at the edges, and engraved with a single word: Hero. Ethan blinked quickly. "Did your mom help you with this?" Benny shrugged. "She helped me order it, but the idea was mine." Ethan knelt, tears threatening. "He'll wear it with pride." He slipped the collar around Ranger's neck. It fit perfectly. The dog gave a single bark, like he understood. From that day, people in Cedar Grove no longer called him the vet in the tin can. They called him the man with the blooming house. Some even came just to sit near the flowers, or to pet Ranger, or to bring Ethan small donations, old clothes, tools, a second-hand radio. Sheriff Daniels dropped by one evening, bringing warm apple pie from his wife and a nod of quiet respect. "You're doing something here, son," he said. "Something this town forgot it needed." And Ethan? He felt it too. Not the weight of what he'd lost, but the beginning of what he was building. By late spring, Cedar Grove had softened. The air, once sharp with silence and suspicion, now carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh paint. The container home that once sat forgotten like a wound on the edge of town had transformed into something else entirely. Bright panels of sky blue and forest green, a little garden blooming defiantly from rusted soil, and a narrow gravel path where Boots and Paws had walked side by side for months. Children now played near the edge of the fence line, their laughter spilling over into the wind. The locals had begun to gather around the place, bringing warm meals, clothes for the shelter, or just themselves for a quiet word with the man who never asked for anything in return. Ethan Walker, 38, once a soldier cloaked in silence, sat on the worn wooden step of his container, shoulders a little more relaxed, face a little less haunted. His brown beard had grown out a bit, speckled with silver strands that caught the sun. The pain hadn't left him, but it had learned to live beside hope. At his feet lay Ranger, his 10-year-old German shepherd, sable-coated with silver streaks, one ear permanently bent from a battlefield explosion, a scar visible on his hind leg. The dog's deep eyes scanned the yard, content but vigilant, his tail thudding lightly every few moments as someone passed. Around his neck was a leather collar with a brass tag that read simply, Hero. The collar had been a gift from a boy named Mason, no older than 8, with crooked teeth and a mop of red curls. Mason had shown up one rainy evening, clinging to his mother's hand, a young single mom who'd lost her job and home. They had stayed in the converted back portion of the container for 3 weeks, during which Ranger became Mason's shadow. On the day they moved into their new apartment, the boy had hugged the dog tightly and slipped the collar around his neck without a word. That small token now shone against Ranger's thick fur as if it had always belonged there. The community had rallied, gradually and quietly. No grand announcements, no newspaper headlines, just acts of kindness passed hand to hand like bread. One morning, a retired carpenter named Bill Jensen stooped from years of work. His face like weathered bark, arrived with a plank of reclaimed wood. Without asking, he began sanding it on Ethan's front step. Ethan had watched, puzzled. "I figure every home's got a name," Bill had said, smiling without looking up. "Thought yours might need one too." A week later, the sign stood proudly in the flower bed, painted in green script, Home of Hope. Ethan had tried to protest, but Bill had cut him off with a shrug. "Not for you, for all of us." Now, months after the first stormy night Ranger curled beside a war-torn man in a cold steel box, the place breathed warmth. It wasn't just a shelter anymore, it was a place where broken things bloomed. That evening, as golden light stretched across Cedar Grove, Ethan walked back inside. The familiar creak of the metal door welcomed him. He moved slowly, his limp more of a habit now than pain, and placed a single candle on the little shelf above his bunk. Next to it stood a worn photograph of his wife Alyssa, smiling wide, freckles scattered across her pale cheeks like stars. He struck a match and lit the wick. The soft glow flickered across her face. "I found it, Liz," he whispered, voice rough. "I found home." Behind him, Ranger shifted, paws tapping lightly against the floor. The dog stepped forward and rested his head against Ethan's knee. A low, quiet bark escaped his throat, gentle, almost human. Ethan smiled and ran a hand through Ranger's fur. "Yeah, I know you knew before I did." Outside, fireflies blinked in the darkening sky, and the sign gently swayed in the evening breeze. A man and his dog sat in silence, not broken, not forgotten, but finally, at peace. Sometimes, God plants miracles not in cathedrals or grand halls, but in the quiet hearts of those the world has forgotten. Ethan didn't find gold, fame, or revenge. He found healing through kindness, purpose through service, and home through a dog's loyalty. Ranger wasn't just a companion. He was a guardian sent in fur and faith. A reminder that even in our lowest moments, heaven may still whisper through the bark of a dog or the kindness of a stranger. The story is a call to believe again, not just in second chances but in the silent, powerful ways God moves. Maybe your container looks different. Maybe your life feels rusty, dented, abandoned. But don't give up, because sometimes hope grows where no one expects it to. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to believe again. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories that honor the forgotten heroes among us, both human and animal. And if you believe that every wounded soul deserves a second chance and every act of kindness matters, type Amen in the comments below. May God bless you and guide you home wherever you are.